joining us in the next minutes. But now, in the afternoon session, we'll have three speakers. First, we'll start with Alex Garnett from Simon Fraser University. He's a digital preservation and, well, data curation librarian, and is a developer of the Open Journal system with PKP. He'll be talking about linking data to journal articles.
That's right. Okay.
Hi.
Thank you, Merce. I think I'm going to use this standing mic, if that's okay. Let me just raise him up a little bit or angle him upward. I can hold this too. Doesn't matter. Okay. As Merce said, I'm Alex Garnett here from Simon Fraser University and the Public Knowledge Project. I'm talking about linking OJS and Dataverse. So I know I don't need to make this point to this audience, but I'll start just slow. We all pretty much, I think, know and agree that in order to really facilitate data sharing, journals have to be on board somehow. And that means at a policy and a technical level. So as developers of OJS, we've made an effort with some gracious support from Sloan and Dataverse to integrate the two systems. So y'all probably also already know OJS. Here's an example of an OJS journal. It's an open source system for publishing preferably, but not only open access content. You can run it on your own server. Right now, there are about 7,000 journals worldwide by our most recent estimate that are actively and regularly publishing using OJS. We've actually made our metrics a bit tighter more recently to have harsher standards for active publication. We've got universal metadata standards, which is very important to this project. Right now we're using basically a form of Dublin core. Interoperability, so we support various APIs and other standards like OAI PMH. And we've got options for backup and replication. OJS supports locks, and we are actually in the process of setting up an OJS locks network for preservation purposes for journal articles. So that's OJS. Y'all probably knew that already, but again, like to kind of get you going there, and we like OJS. So for the past 2 years, we've been working with IQSS on a Sloan Foundation grant with Merce and Micah and members of the Dataverse team, specifically Eleni and Phil up there. So thanks, folks. Hello. On developing an OJS plugin to talk to Dataverse, and on the Dataverse side, a brand new API to facilitate this collaboration. Brief timeline overview. We started this work in June of 2012, so just about 2 years ago now. Started giving talks about it last year at iAssist and the PKP conference. Had a prototype done around the end of last year. Started doing external testing in other people's journals around the end of last year still. We announced the first wide release of the early version of the plugin early this year. We've started external production use in some journals officially as of March, and as of last month, or this month actually, May, we have the Dataverse plugin shipping in the most current release of OJS, which means if you were to today, on your own server, download the newest version of the Dataverse network and the newest version of OJS, get them set up. Linking them is just about as easy as going to the settings page in OJS and entering the Dataverse URL. It's not, that simple, but it's pretty close. So we're pretty pleased about that. We've actually gotten somewhere and released something that's being used inside of 2 years. So far, so good. Just a brief snapshot of our currently committed users. I know Eleni mentioned about 50 earlier on today. Here's just a brief breakdown. We've got the University of Pittsburgh, who's currently running 3 journals, which will be using this plugin. Ubiquity Press, which is a big operation in the UK, an open access publisher. They're also using about 19 journals. University of Alberta, who are brand new Dataverse users, also interested in this work. We haven't got a quite firm count from them yet, but come along pretty well. And then Ontario Scholars Portal, who also runs their own Dataverse network and actually have the first trusted digital repository certification in Canada for their Dataverse implementation. So way to go all around. And then Coaction Publishing, who is a very large hosted client of ours based in Sweden, are also using the plugin, or will be soon. So again, pretty happy about that. What's it do on a base level? So it really improves the file level metadata in OJS by way of getting those files into Dataverse. It's really really, really helps data sharing and archiving via concurrent deposit, which is to say that during the OJS submission process, the data makes its way into Dataverse. There's no requirement for a user to duplicate data entry anywhere, which both lessens the risk of error and ensures that data actually gets cross-deposited in one fell swoop, generates data citations in doing so, and it allows for rapid publication and for peer review of data, because OJS, for those who haven't used it, is very, very workflow focused. It's all based around the review and the editing process, and so this helps the supplemental data actually benefit from the same process in the articles, as the articles rather, in a more structured way. So that's all pretty good. And as I mentioned, this development process has also been probably very singly responsible for helping the Dataverse API get going. We can't take credit for that, of course, but you know, this whole working together and this Sloan grant has really contributed to that work. So it's reusable, it's extensible. We've got, you know, right now kind of the first working implementation, but this is all meant to serve as a model for anybody else wanting to use the Dataverse API. You saw this slide earlier on today already. Just wanted to kind of put it back up there to remind you and refresh this point. There are many different ways for a journal to get set up with a Dataverse. Whether the journal wants to prescribe a recommended Dataverse, whether it wants to link one directly, all these things are possible. And we've got a number of different workflows we can support as well, all of which are configurable in the OJS plugin settings page. So if you want to require data deposit along with the paper in all cases, you can do that. If you want to request the data later, that's fine. And if you like, you can still accept data for papers that actually have not been accepted for publication. So if you want to take a Figshare style model of publishing all the data that comes through your submission pipeline, you can do that too. There's a toggle in the interface I'll show you in a second that actually allows you to say we're going to release the data in Dataverse either as soon as the article is approved to kind of get it published more quickly, or wait for the article publication in OJS so that they can both go up at the same time. So this helps to kind of facilitate a faster moving scholarly workflow. There's a lot of criticism, of course, of how long peer review can take, and this helps get the data out sooner than the article if you want to work that way. So I've got a nice little YouTube video here of myself walking through the plugin. I can click this and listen to my own voice, perhaps. When it's displaying the citation for the OJS article on. So we're not going to listen to my recorded voice right now, but if you want to see a fairly brief overview of how the plugin works, you can go to tinyurl.com/OJSDVplugin, and I'll leave that up for 1 second so y'all can make a note of it. And this basically walks through getting it configured, all the different settings you can use in a workflow sense, and demonstrates how easy it is to link OJS to Dataverse. That said, I can hop out of this presentation real quick and just show you in a live instance what this looks like. So here, for example, is the plugin settings page. This hooks into all of the different policy templates that already exist within OJS and provides links for you to easily edit any of them to better reflect data submission policies. It allows you to, for example, duplicate any terms of use directly from a linked Dataverse and present them to authors, or to enter your own if they somehow differ from the Dataverse instance. You have to reconcile both your article and your data deposit policies. It also lets you select a citation style for generating a data citation. If you've got a DOI plugin enabled in Node.js, you can generate DOIs for deposited articles. Otherwise, you just get URL handles. And again, this is the toggle I mentioned for whether or not you want to require submissions to include data files in Dataverse, and if you want to publish them along with the article, or when accepted. This is what the OJS subfile submission form turns into, so it's a lot more file-level metadata. And here authors are able to provide an external data citation if, for example, they want to cite data that's already deposited elsewhere and not in the linked Dataverse. We've supported that use case as well. And you can opt not to deposit a given subfile for any reason. So it doesn't actually force journals to then all of a sudden only use Dataverse for subfile handling thereafter. It leaves it up to the author, which you can then disable or enable on a case-by-case basis. And then finally, once something is published, The typical landing page for OJS, which has the article abstract and any links to get the HTML or the PDF full text, also contains a data citation link, which goes to the Dataverse network page. I'm not going to click it right now because this is actually a demo instance with a dummy DOI generated, but this goes right to an articles Dataverse page. So back to the presentation. Okay. Gotten some pretty good feedback so far, both from Ontario Scholars Portal, which is the TDR I mentioned, from Dataverse Network releasing slides, from our IDCC talk this year, which went over pretty well, and from one of our developers' former roommates in New Brunswick, who is unusually excited. So, you know, support all around, which we're always happy to see. Currently, the plugin and the API are developed on Sword, which is a XML and zip-driven CRUD API. CRUD, for those of you who don't know, is create, read, update, delete, basically managing file permissions and so forth. It's a nice self-deprecating acronym. Not sure who picked it, but those of you who know. Maintained by Cottage Labs, who are a small UK-based kind of scholarly developer startup-y bunch. They developed Door, for example, and they're pretty good about pull requests, I have to say. So we've been, happy to build on top of their implementation of Sword. And we chose it for this first version of the Dataverse API because we already had a Sword stub in OJS, and because Sword is fairly popular right now. It's a nice, kind of simple standard. It works pretty well. So, next steps. We've got 6 months remaining right now on the Sloan grant period. Dataverse 4.0 is going to be rolling out the door for testing in summer, I think I heard earlier today. Testing in summer, that's okay to hold you to? Not. There you go. Demo site's already up. So we've been talking with the Dataverse devs about a new, less structured JSON API they might want to be migrating to in Dataverse 4.0. This will let us do more than Sword. We don't want to duplicate work, but we've already got the Sword API v1 basically supported, and we're in a good position right now to expand this into a more open-ended JSON-based endpoint. So you might see that happening before this work is all finished up. Again, it's easy for us to kind of work on this right now. So that's Dataverse 4.0. And this is OJS 3. Hey. It looks nicer than OJS 2, doesn't it? Yeah, okay. Don't laugh too hard. So OJS 3 is also happening right now. We've got an alpha out. There'll be a beta pretty soon. It actually borrows the interface from our new Open Monograph Press platform. We're basically backporting that to OJS and then some. So we'll be migrating the Dataverse plugin to OJS 3. It'll be one of the components that ships alongside with OJS 3, so it'll be in there out of the box. Be, again, a nice way to build support for this. And it might actually make OJS better looking than Dataverse. You can laugh because it's unlikely. So you can just kind of think, oh, yeah, okay, it's fine. There's no hurt feelings here. That's it for the main part of the talk. I wanted to give some credit to our collaborator, Jen Whitney, who's a PKP team member at Carleton University in Ottawa. She's actually done about 90% of the dev work on the plugin itself in this case, so hats off to her. Eleni, Phil, and the rest of the Dataverse team has been wonderful to work with. We really appreciate it. And thanks to everyone directly responsible for having this event happen. So I'm going to pause there, and I can take some questions. This is the original Riddler. None of this Jim Carrey, Johnny-come-lately stuff. And depending on what kind of questions you have, we can also do a little bit more demo work if you'd like. So I'll open it up right now. Phil. Oh, yeah, you're going to want this. I can use this guy. Okay.
So as Alex said, I'm the primary developer on the Dataverse side for the Sword stuff, for the Data Deposit API. And I was wondering, did that work?
This says off too, actually, come to think of it.
So I'm good? Talk louder, okay. My name's Phil Durbin. As Alex said, I'm the developer who's worked a lot on the Data Deposit API on the Dataverse side. And I was wondering if you could talk at all about feedback you've gotten so far from the journals,
Yeah.
what they want. You know, I mean, I know we're always talking anyway, but maybe other people could hear and it could spur more discussion of
Sure.
the direction we could go with this API.
Right. So feedback on the interface has been largely positive. I've even heard that the Dataverse settings page looks nicer than the rest of OJS. The Dataverse plugin settings page, mind you. So we can still take credit for that, just in a roundabout way. We have had some edge cases come up where, for example, users are wanting to edit metadata of already deposited files, which currently works because you'd want to allow that. The versioning is all baked in there and so on and so forth. But at the same time, for example, we have to overwrite all of the metadata in one fell swoop when updating it. That could be made more logical for people, that sort of thing. And Eleni, the use case we got from Ubiquity just on Friday.
Yeah, they're trying to figure out for their data journals if, because I guess what their thoughts are, and I need to get more clarification from them, so I'm not entirely sure yet, but I'm assuming because it's a data journal, they want their users to be able to go into Dataverse and be able to edit the data and the metadata themselves instead of getting the editor or the admin of Dataverse to go in for them.
Right.
So more roles and permissions within the plugin and Sword API to allow for more flexibility, I
Right.
guess.
So currently, OJS actually authenticates to Dataverse as an admin user, and all the permissions are then basically managed internally in OJS because that was the most sensible way we had in the first go-around to kind of make them sync up. But we may in the future want to look into actually having different users mirrored in both systems to provide greater flexibility. Yes.
So maybe I missed this in your talk.
They want the mic, sorry. Yep.
Maybe I missed this in your talk, but Eleni, when she was up there, spoke about Dataverse working on support for very large data sets. I'm thinking specifically whole genome sequence and things like that.
Right.
And so I wonder if you're thinking, say, beyond SWORD.
Right.
Because it's not going to really work for those data sets.
No. So at that point, again, if we go forward to this
BitTorrent,
stage-
for example, is people have suggested that,
Yeah,
right?
we've heard from the folks at Academic Torrents. We've invited them to kind of
Right.
give us a prototype. We'll see what we want to do from there. We could also, if we go from SWORD to just a more free-form JSON API, have like a background rsync process or something like that that's a little more reliable for transferring large files. That'd be pretty easy to implement in a new JSON API if we wanted to go that route. So something that's not purely HTTP-based, that would work out pretty well, I think.
Right. So you're planning ahead. And when do you think, between those two efforts, the very large data sets and an interface that supports them?
Yeah.
When do you think that you guys might get there? Is that a couple years out?
Well, the stumbling block there, I would think, is actually the end user upload, because as far as OJS and Dataverse talking in the background, we can run an rsync or something like that,
Yeah, yeah.
right? But to have a end user upload that's not just a browser form
Right.
would require more thought from us.
Right.
And this is something we're actually talking about in digital curation more broadly right now. So I would say, again, for the point of end user upload, that's kind of an unresolved issue right now. We'd have to actually revisit that later on, but we'll see.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks for asking.
If I can answer from the
Yeah.
Dataverse side, the plan of supporting larger scale data sets from terabytes and at some point petabytes, it's more in the next 5 years time frame. So, the user upload is one challenge, but there are a lot of other challenges. Obviously, we propose some work related to using adaptive data storages or other types of data storages that are better suitable than just a file system for querying the data quickly, and also you also need to think of data exploration and visualization tools that will allow you to access that data. It's not only the upload, but it's also how do you explore the data, how do you query it, and how do you analyze it after or download it, right? Because you will need to download subset. And together with the work that we're doing with data citation implementation is the part about how do you provide provenance, citation, attribution to those very large data sets or databases at a subset or granular level.
Right.
So there's a lot of elements to consider as
Yep.
part of that, which are all important and are all in our planning for the next years.
Right. It helps, I guess, at least that most of the files that Dataverse currently supports working with are non-binary. So versioning, at least, is going to be a little easier in that respect. But I don't think there's no Git back into Dataverse right now, is there? That's been talked about, I know, on the listserv, but we're still thinking about that. Well, yeah. Right. Right. Yeah. All right. Last call for questions. Okay. Thanks, folks. I can put this back. That should.
And leads the data program there, and here I'll be opening the doc. Yes, she will be talking about the role of publishers in data access. Jennifer, which one do I open? Number 2. Thank you.
Okay, sorry about this. This is going to take a little bit of coordination, advancing on 2 different computers. So if you'll just bear with me. Hi, I'm Jennifer Lin. I'm Senior Product Manager. Thank you, Mercedes, for the intro. And I'm just going to kind of give you a brief overview of what we've been thinking about at PLOS and the conversations that we've been having with the community. All right, this is a riff off of the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner, if you're familiar with the actual quote. If you're not, don't worry. It's data everywhere, nor any drop to drink. So it's a marooned mariner who's out there and he has no more water, and yet it is everywhere around him, taunting him. I feel like this was kind of in my mind as an apt metaphor, thinking about, data are infrastructure for research, and yet we obviously, as this group, and as well as those listening in on the conversation abroad, that there is a disparity between how much data we are creating and how much data we have access to as researchers. So Science Magazine, in the February 2011 issue, revealed this set of survey results. I'm sure that many of you have seen this, so pardon me. But basically, they conducted a survey on the availability and use of data. They got 1,700 responses with representation across research areas and geographic regions. Here we see that 77% of the researchers have asked colleagues for data, while they've had difficulty in getting it 50% of the time. 44% of the researchers go to published literature for the data, 44% of them go to repositories. What all of these figures attest to overall for me is that there is a recognized demand for researchers to access others' data. This is kind of a no-brainer, but in my mind, there haven't been a lot of widespread studies that have actually given us the statistics surrounding this. And so I think this is a really meaningful figure. And in fact, I believe that this view undercounts the real need. So if there's proven demand for data, why aren't they available? Let's flip to the other hat that researchers wear and examine the situation as one doing the research, generating the data as part of their research project. While there are many underlying reasons for why data may not be available, which can take us all day to enumerate, this one particular figure highlights a piece of the puzzle in a stark way. Here we see that data are not stored. Here we see that data are stored just on servers, university servers, in a community repository. It may be in a shoebox at home, marked under other. They are in a number of places, but where it is not at, by and large, is in a place where others can access. I like this figure, 52.2% is our lab. And as Bill mentioned earlier in the Tim Vine study, I won't rehash it, except just to add that even on top of this dim view, it gets worse, because over time, as the publication date extends, the chances of accessing data with older literature is far worse. Almost all research data, in fact, is lost 10 to 15 years after publication, unavailable for replication, reanalysis, meta-analysis, or even if a question arises about the veracity of the research. So in an otherwise parched land, where data access might feel more like this, even if you are marooned on a raft surrounded by water data, we do have a few trees living and growing, Dryad and Dataverse being two examples in this land, repositories that are recreating the groundwork for what may otherwise be a thriving and abundant landscape one day. There's been a new metaphor proposed by an assortment of people, organizations thinking about data in a dedicated and thoughtful manner, which characterizes our vision at PLOS. This is a term that I've been using, and I think we'll hear more of, a social contract. This contract is an agreement amongst all stakeholders in the research ecosystem, including, but not limited to, data centers, funders, institutions, researchers, technologists, infrastructure groups, based on shared and governing principles. These principles that data should be preserved, discoverable, measured, and integrated into evaluation processes, that data sharing is a fundamental practice. Adherence to the social contract will entail dramatic changes to existing social norms, workflows, technologies, funding arrangements, and incentives for all the members of the research ecosystem. To this end, we at PLOS, we've been spending a lot of time talking and listening to groups across the community, across all the stakeholder groups, as well as subgroup constituencies. And one of the things that we started off with was a new data policy that was implemented in March of this year. It was the tail end of a very long effort talking to the community. We had members in the community represented by editors-in-chiefs, by funders, by editorial boards across all of our journals, researchers directly, other publishers, et cetera. But basically, if you're not familiar with this policy, it is an extension of an existing policy. We now require, as we did before, that authors make all their data underlying the findings described in their manuscript fully available, without restriction, with rare exception. When submitting a manuscript online, authors must provide a data availability statement describing compliance with this policy. And the data availability statement will be published with the article of accepted. We have a number of acceptable data sharing methods, the first and foremost being data deposition in a formal repository such as Dryad or Dataverse. And data and supporting information files is also acceptable. Possible alternatives that are accepted on a subject, are subject to case-by-case evaluation include data made available to all interested researchers upon request, but only where deposition is not ethical or legal. Or data available from a third-party source where authors cannot guarantee the primary data set themselves, but it is available. And first and foremost, that the failure to comply may affect decision to consider the manuscript, evaluation. And if after publication researchers cannot obtain the data, PLOS may publish a correction, contact authors' institutions, in some cases, extreme cases, withdraw publication. So what were the aims of the update? I won't go through all of them, but basically they were to clarify what was the position before, to highlight the author's responsibility, so to continue to establish these social norms that were in agreement between all publishers who have this type of data policy, and begin to try to enforce this much better. Why did we do this? Well, from the perspective of PLOS as an open access publisher, because open access, Open access to a written narrative about the research and a snapshot of the data is not the most useful way of providing what we really truly feel is true open access to research. Because full open access to the data underlying the articles makes it more useful and reasonable. Because our previous policy asked people to share but didn't enforce this transparently. Because this is a lot easier for human readers to read, even though it's fuzzy, as well as machine readers to find data and be able to use it quickly and accurately. So in the larger setting, we've also been doing, as I mentioned, continuing to engage the community. One of the other things that we did, this is back in February, was to bring together a group of people, data leaders that included repository heads, librarians, funders, infrastructure builders, program directors, developers, and research, to ask them what can publishers do to promote the work of libraries and institutions in advancing data access and availability. Through a facilitated discussion, a range of priorities and recommendations for publishers were developed by the group. We wrote up the report, sent it out for community comment. At the RDA meeting, we presented some of the preliminary responses to this, and the report will be out for formal publication fairly soon, we hope, in a journal. I'll try to go over briefly what were these types of community recommendations so that you can get a sense in advance of the actual journal publication. We certainly recognize that this is a complex environment with far many stakeholders and groups and actors. And so the effort, just to clarify, when bringing together this group to talk about what publishers can do is not at all to imply that publishers alone may act and solve the situation, all told. But to focus in on what, given that there is a new social contract made up of a lot of stakeholders, all of which must collectively own this process, what specifically can publishers do? One of the things is to establish and enforce a mandatory data availability policy. This really surprised us that this group of people in the community has actually elevated this to a #1 recommendation. It was a great affirmation following our data policy. Contribute to establishing community standards for data management, enact and enforce them as journal policies. Contribute to establishing these standards for data preservation, because they will be somewhat different. Provide formal channels as publishers to share the data, whether it is to link directly out to the repositories, whether it's to make the data that they have accepted as part of the manuscript far more readable and more usable. Work with repositories more directly to streamline data submission. We hear over and over again that researchers need this to be a very easy process. This is obviously to benefit us all, but it's certainly to lower the bar and lessen the amount of friction entailed when we have resistance amongst researchers with the time demands that they have on them. #6, require appropriate citation to all data associated with a publication, both produced and used. Now, in the question as to what the citation format looks like, what are the metadata standards necessary to get these citations into indices, all of those are big questions that we need to answer, but at the very highest level, we need to move in this direction where these citations are required. Develop and report indicators to support data as a first-class scholarly input. This is a big question as to how we do so, but at the highest level, the aim here was to try to further incentivize and establish these norms of practices for data to be shared by the researchers, and which kind of dovetails into #8. So community engagement continues, and this was not a slide to ask you to actually read all of the questions or any of the questions, but really to demonstrate that this is a very, very complicated area just for recommendation #1, where we're talking about a mandate for data sharing, a data access policy. Too many to go over, but just this small set shows that it is complex and that there are a lot of things, tricky things that we as publishers need to continue thinking about and discussing with the community. The coordination continues. There have been a number of organizations already mentioned today that are kind of centers or nexi for some of these conversations. We're very thankful that they have cropped up over the recent years, RDA, et cetera, and we do feel that as publishers we can continue to invest more in engaging in these conversations to support the larger efforts. So as a publisher, what does it actually look like to practically address the recommendations? As an entity that both publishes content, which is underlying data located elsewhere, as well as keeper of a certain amount of data, whether it's in figures tables or SI files, what do we do to ensure that the future no longer looks like this? Well, to start, we're going to have to open up the digital toolbox and start building tools to make this happen. And build crosswalks across all the data touch points in the research process. Now, as a publisher, the role, again, as I mentioned before, is not to solve all of these problems, but to the extent that there are, in fact, touch points, whether it's at the submission system, at the point of peer review, at the point of actually publishing the research narratives and linking out to the research data, or providing tools in which the research data can be more readily used, there are a number of things. And I'll just quickly go through some examples. So at the point of collection, think about workflows that could capture the research data from the laptop or the bench or the field or the clinic and make it more readily shareable. Think about how we can create a more supportive authoring environment to share the results and the underlying data. On the point of archiving and discovery, there are a number of examples or areas in which publishers can think about working on. Actually enforcing the data access policies, which many journals already have, creating a tighter workflow and technology integration with the repositories, standards for discoverability, interpretability, and subsequent reuse of data, participate more in those discussions, and syndication of the data metadata. That's a mouthful, to the indices in order to make it actually discoverable. In the area of citation and credit, data provenance and metadata syntax is clearly very important. Bidirectional linking, this has overlap with the one before. Attribution and more granular contributorship credit is something that we need to think about. Data usage and activity metrics as well. For presentation, standardized structured metadata for data availability, insofar as that there is a description, a dedicated section on your articles. Interactive statistics and visualization tools that will allow readers to really get into and analyze the data while they're in the framework of the article itself online. Links to the entire data package with media, code, materials, and other dependencies. Semantic versioning for all article and data annotations. And finally, reusability, very, very important, especially from the perspective of true open access. Machine readability of data is not a given. We do have to think about the technical concerns to make this actually happen. Discoverability, as was mentioned, and system interoperability, because we all know this is not all happening within one journal with a particular platform system. It is happening across and it is distributed, and we need to figure out within the larger research information framework how all of this is going to talk to each other. So back to the basic question, what is the role of publishers? No single answer, but I'll close with just some thoughts. Publishers play one of the critical roles in this collective space, be they commercial or nonprofit, society, open access, institutional, et cetera, because of the existing importance of formal publications that exist today within the academic incentive structure. They do currently occupy a leverage point in the research process. We definitely see an opportunity for this to become a strong force in affecting social and technical change. Publishers can serve as implementation or enforcement arm at the point of publication for the governing principles already mentioned. They have the potential to serve as honest brokers, listening to concerns from institutions and libraries about these very complex issues surrounding data curation and publication, and engaging continually with the stakeholders to help establish and enforce standards that suit the community as a whole and ensure access to data underlying the works they publish. Publishers can also collaborate and coordinate with their efforts with repositories and funders to cement the principles of data sharing and reuse as mutual stewards of the new ecosystem. I want to thank you all for this opportunity, and a special thank to Dr. Thea Bloom for the leadership that she has provided in the data policy, as well as all things data at PLOS, as well as all the participants in our meeting in February that we hosted, the Role of Publishers meeting. Any questions? Please feel free to contact me. Thank you.
We have a few minutes for questions. That's a great, great talk, by the way, and thanks for leading this data access policy with publishers. It's a very good example of what publishers can do.
You focused on very important stakeholders, professional stakeholders, but they're also, we have now a much more sophisticated public. We have concerned citizens. There's a lot of research that deals with the community engagement, meaning people that are out there that are now reading the scientific articles. And I'm wondering if there's any attempt to engage them in this process as well.
Thank you for the question. I think that's a very good question, and a slightly difficult one to answer in the sense that they're a diffuse audience, certainly recognized as a participant of this larger ecosystem. So I think, just speaking off the cuff for myself, I do view it more as a trickle-down approach, to the extent that they have needs. We do hope that their particular set of needs may not be as unique and captured by existing stakeholders for where we do have formal mechanisms.
Okay, thank you.
Have you seen resistance from authors submitting papers?
That is a very good question. So there was quite a firestorm prior to the actual data policy that went into effect. And we've been working with the community. That has, by and large, completely cleared away. I think there was a lot of social media resistance, individuals that said, well, we'll vote with our feet, et cetera. To date, we only have knowledge, I think, of 2 particular instances where the needs of the researchers were not able to be met as part of the new data policy, implementing the new data policy. So I think that researchers, they as I mentioned, they have 2 hats, right? Well, they have many hats, but of the many, there's 2. They generate the data, they do their research, but they also need, in order to do their research, they need to access the literature. So I think that cooler heads are prevailing in the sense that while much of their resistance may have to do with the additional work that they see, rightly or wrongly, entailed in complying with this data policy, they also know that their own work will be much easier were they to cooperate in this brave new world.
So we've never received a Dryad request from an editor, to my knowledge, for an embargo period on a data set. I'm wondering, is that a matter of policy? Or how, if a researcher were to come with a long-term study and say, I'm okay depositing it, I want to publish it, but can you wait a few years before it's openly accessible? I didn't. Maybe I missed it, but I didn't see that addressed within the...
No, there is not an affordance for embargo period. In the same way that our journal publication policy for full, immediate open access, there's no embargo period either.
Any other questions? So we'll move to the last talk of the afternoon, and then we should have time for questions for overall for the entire day. So we're very happy to have here Cliff Duke, the director of science program in the for the Ecological Society of America, and an expert on policy, well, public policy science. So we'll be talking about professional standards and ethical norms for data reuse.
Thank you.
And,
On the desktop here. Right there, down there.
perfect. Okay.
Thank you very much. I want to start off the talk by just briefly acknowledging where this talk came from. My co-author, John Porter at the University of Virginia, and I developed this paper for bioscience last June under the auspices of the Data One project that Bill Michener directs, and it came out of a series of conversations that John and I had during Data One meetings. So a little bit of background, none of which will be new to anybody in this room. First of all, the data deluge, which many people have talked about in recent times, greater capabilities for gathering, storing, accessing, and sharing data, and coming with that, of course, opportunities to use and analyze multiple data sets, including, obviously, those not originated by the user, making the cover of places like The Economist with the wonderful upside-down umbrella, and, of course, lots of variations of these exponential curves in terms of data generation and availability. What are the benefits of sharing data? Again, none of this is news to any of you, but I wanted to review it briefly as background for the paper. First and foremost is scientific progress. We of the scientific community as a whole benefit from the ability to discover, access, and analyze diverse data sets of all kinds. Secondly, related closely to that is replication. The ability to replicate results of analyses is a fundamental element of the scientific process. But replication, particularly in the environmental field where we have a lot of one-time observations of nature, is really only possible if the data are preserved and made publicly available. Third, there are human rights implications. Article 15 of the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights defines that everyone has the right to, quote, enjoy the benefits of scientific progress and its applications. But failure to be able to access data restricts that right in ways that I think we can all pretty well imagine. Data preservation is obviously a topic dear to the hearts of everybody in this room. Data that are not systematically archived are frequently lost as a result of a variety of computer failures and simple neglect. Data integrity, multiple users make it more likely that deficiencies in data will come to light. And finally, a core issue of public trust, particularly in the face of controversy, as we've seen in a number of public controversies in science recently, areas like climate change. The willingness to share data can be a key factor in increasing the trust of the public in scientific research. And all of these things together, of course, can help fight the famous data entropy curve that Bill mentioned earlier in his talk today. So what are the obstacles to data sharing? Although technology, obviously including Dryad, has eliminated a lot of the technological obstacles to data sharing, there are still a lot of cultural issues that are out there that a number of us have talked about. Fear of data misuse or lack of use. To borrow Jim Richmond's old trope, people are afraid of sharing data because nobody will be interested in it. Loss of competitive advantage and benefits to the data originator, people getting scooped by their own data. Loss of personal ownership of the data, closely linked to that. The lack of a reward system. A number of people today have mentioned the need to incentivize data sharing and archiving. Lack of training in how to go about it is also an issue. And finally, sensitive data issues, things like human-related data, data related to endangered species or cultural artifacts, and so forth. I was intrigued at the mention of a data tagging system earlier today. It might go some way toward addressing those issues. So how do we overcome those obstacles? Nature editorial a couple of months ago mentioned the need for research communities to agree on standard etiquette for data sharing. Observed that clear guidelines on data reuse are lacking, with some, they estimated, over 600 subject-specific repositories with a lot of community-specific standards. So how do we arrive at some common ground? So the objective of this exercise that John and I went through over several Data One meetings was to offer up some ethical guidelines for consideration by the scientific community. We wanted to start a conversation with all of you and lots of other people out there without necessarily prescribing a set of solutions. So briefly, first, I want to talk about obligations of data generators, and then in somewhat more detail, talk about the obligations of people who would reuse others' data. First of all, data generators, as we all agree, I think, are obliged to provide the data supporting publications in a timely fashion, preferably before publication through the various mechanisms that we've discussed repeatedly today. They need to ensure the accuracy and clarity of their metadata, and they should not place unreasonable constraints on the use of data, things like extended embargo periods, complex permissions policies, and so forth. So what are the obligations of data users? First and foremost, attribution in some way or form, and I'll go through several examples of what that means, but it's critical to say where the data came from. The first and oldest and probably simplest method is simple acknowledgement in the acknowledgement section of a paper. Thanks to so-and-so for providing this particular set of data. Secondly, citation, the wide range of citation methods that are being developed through efforts like DataCite, the Research Data Alliance, and others. Ideally with digital object identifiers. Those are not always possible depending on the, how data are made available. Multiple efforts are underway through that. There are limits to data citation, things like informally exchanged data, loosely structured data, or obviously data that are not archived. But those are two of the beginnings of attribution. What I want to get into in a little bit more detail, though, in this talk is issues about providing co-authorship to data sources and walk you through some principles and some examples about how co-authorship might be considered. First of all, there's an argument about how integral data are to the manuscript. That is, how many other data sources were used in the research. If the data in the manuscript come from a single source, a strong case can be made for authorship. If you're getting all your data, say, from one data source that belongs to somebody else, there's a good case to be made for that. It's also appropriate, co-authorship is also appropriate if there are unique or novel characteristics of the data, whether it's the methodology by which they were collected, the sampling design, spatial or temporal extent, or the level of integration of the data. And of course, another key issue is the availability and willingness of a potential co-author to participate. Although we point out in the paper, and I would re-emphasize here, that should not be an obstacle or a limiting factor for using the data. Again, it's obligatory on the part of data generators not to place unreasonable constraints on the use of data. Illustrate with a couple of figures here. This is a classic diagram of criteria for authorship with data acquisition added to it. So typically, the two items on the right, drafting, revision, final approval, are required elements for offering authorship. And then the two items on the upper and middle left there, at least one of those two should also be present typically for authorship in the environmental sciences. Data acquisition, at least in the environmental and ecological sciences, is not necessarily a criterion for authorship, although it is often so in the medical field. So I'm going to go from here now to reaching down into the detail a little bit of data acquisition. But again, this is one set of criteria for authorship. And so here, if you turn your head sideways, and I've got mine written out so I can tell them to you, we've offered 4 criteria that we would suggest have to be met for a data provider to be included as an author. First of all, repeating a little bit of what I said in the previous slide, are the data integral to the analysis? Are they necessary to the analysis in the new paper? Are the data novel or unique? Is the data provider willing to share authorship? Obviously, you've got to have their cooperation. And finally, are they able to participate? And I'll illustrate that with a few examples in a moment. But we suggest that all 4 of these are necessary for authorship to be offered to a data provider. So going into a few examples here. First example is that a data provider has collected high-resolution data on the locations of small mammals over an extended period. The data are made available in a repository. So there's some nice data set in Dryad about small mammal distributions, and a second researcher downloads those data and applies spatial statistics to characterize the social dynamics of a species. Should the researcher contact the data provider regarding authorship? Without asking you for an answer, I'll tell you what our suggested answer is. The data are clearly essential to the success of the manuscript. They are the data set that is being used in the new manuscript, presumably because of their novel characteristics. So a strong case can be made that the data provider should be offered an opportunity to collaborate on the manuscript. However, again, emphasizing again, even if the data provider declines to participate, that should not be an obstacle to the use of the data. But it's appropriate that the new researcher offer that opportunity to the data originator. Second example, researchers assembled data on nutrient levels from 3 streams and used them to test hypotheses regarding the seasonality of nutrient loading. Data from each of these streams comes from different sources: a graduate student, a senior professor, no longer with us, and a government agency. This is a little bit more complicated because the researcher has to decide if the paper would be publishable if they didn't have all 3 of these, if they only had 2 or 1 of them, or if there are other data sets that could be substituted. So in this case, we would suggest the graduate student is a potential co-author, obviously, hopefully alive and kicking and able and interested in cooperating with the research. We don't give co-authorships to people who have passed on unless they, in rare instances where somebody has gotten nearly all the way through a paper, things like that. But for people to start a new paper using somebody else's data, that's not considered appropriate. And we don't ordinarily give authorships to institutions or agencies. So in this case, it's a little bit more complicated. And again, emphasizing that whether or not, say, the student accepts cooperation, the research should still go forward. Paper should be published. Third instance that we suggested is a researcher who develops a model for predicting storm movement and tests it using data from 250 different stations, each operated independently. This one is again straightforward. There are 250 different sources of data. And we don't typically offer authorship to 250 different people. It's very impractical. And in this case, presumably, none of those data sets are unique or integral to the manuscript in numbers like that. So it's improbable that any one data set is critical. So our simple answer to this question is no, absolutely not. Leads us to a few ethical principles that I say we put out there as a conversation to have with all of you, looking to have people adopt them, to modify them, to argue with them, and so forth. And first, speaking back to Jennifer's very thoughtful talk on the responsibilities of publishers, publishers should revise authorship guidelines to address the contributions of data providers. We ought to formally recognize the role of data providers in papers and make sure that that's covered in our code of ethics for publishers and for professional societies, organizations like ESA that are both. Secondly, data generators should make public the data underlying their publications in a timely fashion. Again, I think that's becoming pretty widely established as a basic ethical obligation in the community, although we're still evolving on that point. And again, need to make sure that the associated metadata are accurate and clear. Conditions for the use of the data should never include restrictions that limit the range of scientific conclusions that can be reached. One of the big cultural obstacles that we all talk about is, what if those guys reach conclusions that are diametrically opposed to mine when I generated the data? The core argument is here, that's how science works. And that we ought not to place those kinds of restrictions on things, even if people are going to arrive at conclusions that we don't necessarily agree with. The data users, on the other hand, again, have an obligation to cite their sources through formal citations when they can, or at the very least through the classic acknowledgement that we've all used for many, many years. And they don't all fit on one slide, so there's a few more. Co-authorship should be offered to data providers if the data are integral to the manuscript and if they can meet the other conditions of authorship that I've described. If a data provider declines to accept authorship, perhaps because of scientific disagreements, the use of the data publication should proceed. And finally, again, emphasizing the ethics of sharing data. I've expressed the view in editorials and elsewhere that sharing data is a core ethical obligation for scientists because the timely sharing of data benefits both science and society. A couple of comments about a path forward. As a Nature editorial noted recently, the real key is trust between the data generators and the data users, whoever they are. And a very nice paper in PLOS Biology recently emphasized a number of incentives for encouraging a culture of data archiving. And I want to highlight 2 of those. They had 4 of them. First is encouraging communication between the collectors and users, what they called an etiquette of communication in Roach et al. This can reduce duplication of effort, can reduce the risk of alternative interpretations of data if everybody can perhaps agree on common analyses and conclusions. And one hopes that it can facilitate collaboration, build new research teams between the people who generated the data and those who are taking a fresh look at it. Related closely to that is disclosing the ethics of data reuse. Publishers should require disclosure of the reuse details. Those of us who are in the journal business should make sure that there's a clear understanding of where data come from, they're adequately cited and disclosed. Related to that, Roach et al. Suggested allowing data collectors to review the papers. Now that might result in, again, arguments over conclusions and content, but that was a suggestion they made to help build up trust, I think, between those who generate and those who would reuse data. And finally, as a path forward, there's a real need to incorporate standards for data sharing and reuse into professional codes of ethics, again, by professional societies and others. And quoting the March Nature, which had a very nice piece on data sharing, before you can climb the highest mountains, you need proper safeguards and a decent nap. Thank you. Questions
Thanks very much.
or comments or arguments?
You have a question too? Sure. I'll go after.
Yeah, so I think you're drilling down into this issue of when the data interpretation is in contention is where it gets interesting. The original JDAP idea was the same as what you just said in the Roach paper, where the original authors would have the option of reviewing, and so their points could be made, but it doesn't account for if there's misinterpretation in early stages by the reuser that could be headed off in the first place, right? So if you know at the outset that your interpretation is going to be competing due to issues that may not have to do with anything that could be clarified by looking at the data together, methodological, philosophical differences between scientists that happen all the time. Your suggestion is nonetheless that the second party should contact the first party and say, I want to use your data to completely counter the argument you made in yours. And do you want to be an author on this paper that trashes you? So that I'm just not sure how that would work in practice.
Right. Yeah. And I quoted the Roach comment partly because I thought it was interesting, not necessarily because I agreed with it. Because certainly I don't work on the publishing side of ESA, but I certainly think that consciously inviting reviewers who arguably have a conflict of interest could set up other kinds of ethical dilemmas. But I thought it was an interesting argument to make. My own view leans towards the early communication about data reuse, in part because as careful as people may be about documenting metadata and sources and so forth, I still think there are going to be things that are implicit knowledge on the part of data generators, which it would behoove data reusers to learn and know as closely as they can, assuming the generators are willing to cooperate.
So you're an editor who has to decide if they've kind of complied with this ethical obligation. Are you going to ask the secondary authors to come to you with the correspondence with the original ones that said, you know, we have this dispute, it's irresolvable, they shouldn't be editors because there's a COI and they didn't want to contribute to the paper.
Right. What I'd rather do is throw that back out to you, but I would argue that the paper should move forward if if the science is defensible.
Right, but is
despite the
the editor's responsibility to make that determination, or the original authors?
Oh, I see your point. One thing I would want to do is ask the editors in the room, but I mean, it seems to me ultimately it has the ultimate decision would have to come down to the editor. But I'd be curious to know any other people who are publishers or journal editors in the room, how they would respond to that. Any?
Authorship is always tricky. I mean,
Yeah.
even on a straightforward paper, I don't think editors would ever want to wade into this.
Yeah.
I mean, we do wade into a lot of authorship issues,
Sure.
but this could be a nightmare.
Yeah.
And then what about editors who disagree with this type of policy?
Right.
So I'm not sure this would be a thing that editors, there's only some things that
Yeah.
are good for us to do.
Well, anybody else is thinking? Oh, okay. I have a related question, but I can go after you. But, and I'll stay here, I guess. I don't have to go back and forth. So some of us in this room have been very involved in the Joint Declaration data citation principles, and I think part of the hope, more than a hope, but what we're trying to promote with those guidelines or high-level principles is that data citation by itself provides the incentive, the incentive for authors to, data generators
Absolutely, sure.
to share data, but also,
Yeah.
in a way, it's the incentive that if instead of going to the co-authorship route, that you could say, well, if you're going to cite the data, the data that has been used for in that publication, right? That there is you give attribution or enough recognition and credit to the data generators already through that citation. So maybe co-authorship then is not as necessary. So what would you say about that, and how do we evaluate?
I think it's an important point. I mean, a great many of us, most people in this room, have had conversations about the desire to make data generation and data citations as what I want to say as strong an element in one's career as publication,
Right.
and hopefully as strong an element in things like hiring and promotion decisions as actual papers. And I think to the extent that those changes come about and that those cultural changes can be made, I think that will respond to your question, that then perhaps sorting out issues of authorship becomes less significant because citing my data set is as good as citing my classic paper.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
That's actually a perfect lead into my question, which was about cultural change and sort of recognition of data as a product. You know, so various new mechanisms for doing that we've seen are, co-authorship is one of them. Beyond citation, another one is the idea of sort of a data publication, where the role of the publication itself is just to describe the data set, and therefore you can cite the publication. Or also sort of data products on their own, disconnected from publications, being considered in tenure and promotion processes. And that's sort of an observation. I guess my question is, from your experience with interacting with scientists in your field, how, those three different realms, which do you feel like has more traction than the others? Do you feel like scientists are more likely to go into new, ventures with co-authorship, or are they more likely to revise their tenure and promotion guidelines? And how do you see those fitting together?
right. On the data publication, data paper part, and Bill's in the room. He's the editor of a lot of these. ESA can take credit for having started data papers more than 15 years ago, I believe, about 1997, if I have my numbers right. And Bill, among his other hats, is the editor of ESA's Ecological Archives and oversees some of our data paper process. So I don't know if you want to comment on that, Bill, at all. If I can put you on the spot.
There's a lot I could comment on here. It's been a really interesting evolution in terms of getting that adopted by the society members and so on. One of the most interesting challenges, I think, has been creating a culture of peer review for those data papers. And that has, I think now it's widely accepted by the community, and I don't have to search any harder to get someone to review the data papers than one might have trouble getting to review a journal paper. Even though it takes a lot more effort and so on, and it's usually a good learning experience for them. We did publish a paper in the this past year in the Journal of I'll have to do a quick search on it. It's open access journal, and it's we discussed the peer review process and some of the interesting challenges there, and the comment that you made, I think, is particularly appropriate, which is that really no matter how much metadata is there, it's almost never enough for someone that is a naive user to come in and take that data set and not have any problems whatsoever or any questions arise in terms of trying to reproduce the results. So again, I can't emphasize enough how important metadata is. We see lots of individuals, taking shortcuts with respect to documentation and so on. But again, if we are going to truly support reproducibility down the road, we need to make a lot more headway with respect to the documentation, and then we probably need to make a lot more headway with respect to incorporating workflows and provenance in a more automated fashion into how we're creating these data objects and so on. So again, during the break I could talk for hours about this, but probably not.
Yeah, and just a quick comment about how that's changed within our one society. Some years ago, David Baldwin, our managing editor, said that for the first few years, the modal number of data papers in any given year was 0. And now I think if you look at the two journals which typically publish data papers, Ecology and Ecological Applications, there are typically 3 or 4 in every issue. So it's within our own membership that has changed, at least in a small way.
It's a follow-up to Bill, so are you on the same topic? I'll make mine brief. As Phil Bourne isn't here, I'll just mention that he published a paper in PLOS One describing his own lab's attempt to replicate their own work. So this is like, it's all in the same lab, the documentation should be good, they know the domain, they know what they're talking about. And I think the number was 87 person days to recreate something about the mycobacteria drugome. So I think I'm all for this perfect future, but I also think there's an awful lot of human problems to be solved before we get there.
Yeah, just to pick up on that, one of the motifs or proverbs, if you like, that or mottos that we used in the Managing Research Data program for GIST was the first person with whom you share your data is your future self. And I think we've all hit, whether it's in our lab as in Theo's example or looking back at data that we've created ourselves and think, what did I?
Yes.
I thought that was really interesting, that the survey of those ethical issues and sort of a number of sort of little comments and questions. It struck me that ethical issues, yes, that's how we talk about this in publishing, but in a sense it's etiquette, isn't it? It's polite etiquette.
Yes, right.
It's polite to ask.
Yeah, that's why I like the Rochdale phrase, the etiquette of communication.
And another comment, the MRC in the UK, the Medical Research Council, are one of the few research councils, to my knowledge, who in their data availability policy, stress that it's likely that the reuse of data in partnership with the original data creators is likely to lead to better research, better reuse, because of that knowledge inside the data, with how the data were created, etc. But I want to reiterate, and I think oftentimes that will be true, but I want to reiterate what I think Bill said, and what Messe said as well, that it's really important that we stress, nevertheless, whatever the attitude of the original data creator, that to its reuse or to co-authorship or whatever, that it should be possible to reuse simply with citation and not with acknowledging co-authorship, and that data creators should do their utmost to provide sufficient metadata to enable that without co-authorship,
Right,
because
right.
it really is about the reuse.
And sooner
and
or
I
later-
think you stressed that, but
Well,
I
no,
think
and
it's
I agree.
worth
And
underlining.
sooner or later, we're all unavailable to participate. So
I have also a follow-up comment, but after you.
Oh, sorry, you were walking over. I wanted to comment on the co-authorship. I like the idea that it can help with understanding the data and all that, but I agree with the data citation rather than co-authorship, because if you're using someone's scientific study, biological basis, where you're building on using their conclusions, shouldn't they get co-authorship too? Because you're building on something that they have created and provided that's essential for your study? I see sort of a
Well, perhaps.
slope.
And that's in part why we tried in the examples to outline some of the gray areas, because just as if I wrote a review paper, an imaginary one that was based on only 3 literature papers, I'm pretty much borrowing everybody else's work, as opposed to the more typical one where there are several hundred citations. So again, getting back to that issue of how integral the data are to the study, things of that sort, we wanted to suggest that there were some grounds for suggesting co-authorship if the data you're using, if the paper you're writing would be not doable at all with those data. And I would suggest that extends to the citation argument too. It's easy to set up straw person examples, of course. But.
So what strikes me as at odds with the sort of social contract, as I understand it, is that there's no further need for any contributorship beyond that original data provision for co-authorship in the second paper, right? So
No.
yeah, so that seems odd to me.
No. I hope in the.
Sort of, they need to read, they need to debate interpretation, they need to.
Right. Yeah. No, because
They need to participate
right,
in
we,
the.
We did not intend to throw out the other criteria. I'll just flip back to this diagram. Let's see. Again, coming back to here, the classic criteria for authorship, which include these as typically mandatory, and at least one of the analysis / conception things. So this is not a sole criterion for authorship. Anyone else?
Yeah, so I think I liked your talk a lot, and I guess my one thought that occurred to me was that despite our desire, and with Mercedes, I worked on the data citation principles quite extensively, and I'm still working with them. Despite our desire that data citation and the authorship of data should provide some incentive for sharing it, we also have to kind of provide some kind of on-ramp or compatibility to the way things work now. And I think that not only does, from a lot of perspectives, but also incentivization, this co-authorship actually works. Mm-hmm. I think that it is a much better sell to people that I work with in biomedical sciences, in the Harvard community. I mean, hard to get people to share their data, actually, except in organized centers, right? And I think this sort of co-authorship really is one of the pieces of the puzzle here.
I just wanted to add that the Long-Term Ecological Research Network in the U.S., which has been around for 30-some years now, I think under the instigation of one of the program officers at NSF, who's no longer with us, Tom Callahan, but he came up with the idea that, which was quite controversial at the time, that all data should be available through the LTR network and should be readily shared with at most like a one-year embargo. And that generated just an incredible amount of angst, as you might imagine, back in the 80s and so on. But one of the offshoots of that was that even the people that feared it the most, 90-some% of all researchers in LTR discovered that it was a big benefit to them. And what happened was, someone would discover their data through the LTR database, and they would contact the original authors, and they would collaborate with them and possibly others as well doing these large synthesis efforts and so on, and end up with papers that got lots more citations than anything they had done individually. So again, it ended up being a win-win for everyone. And everyone pretty much, I think there were only one or two exceptions that I have heard rumors of, everyone learned to play well in the same sandbox. So that was a very positive story there.
I don't know if there are any more questions, or just wanted to add, we're seeing that seems like various approaches to incentivizing the processes are important, and could be data citation, could be authorship, and could be other ways of collaborating across different data generators and authors and article authors. There is one more approach or other initiatives that are related to that on reproducibility and replication of previous work that also would help to provide incentives for both for publisher sides and for funding agencies to doing studies that involve reproducing results from others, and that would help to realize also what is the extent of the information that you need, or the documentation and metadata you need, the data in order to reproduce. So I think we should also take that into consideration here. Yeah. And I don't know, Todd, if you want to say a few last words. Thank you. Thank you. And thanks, everybody. Before we break, because after that there is a meeting, a Dryad meeting, right?
So thanks, everyone, to coming for the main session. This concludes, I guess, our Dryad Dataverse community meeting part. We'll continue the live stream and maybe delay the break, come back here at 20 for the membership business meeting for Dryad. It's open. People are welcome to sit in. Voting happened online, so those of you who are members have already participated in that. But we'll be announcing the results of the elections and things during the business meeting, and get feedback from you about directions for Dryad. So I want to give a big thanks to Merce and Dataverse community here who joined us in this. It's been really valuable for us to get together in this way, and learned a lot, and obviously a lot of shared vision. So thank you all, and if you're taking off, thanks for coming, and see some of you in a few minutes.